sending the attendance roster around. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to start out talking about the material today that was assigned for today, the topics, which is primarily about zoning and various types and aspects of zoning. And so there'll be lecture and discussion of the material for a chunk of the class. We will, in the latter part of the class, go back to the Allen courtroom, and we will talk about a couple of things. One is that each of you will have your designated representative or representatives of your group present your examples of good and bad planning to the rest of us, and so we'll take turns. And it won't, obviously can't be everybody, but some representatives of one of the teams will sit up at the hearing table at the sort of think of it as the judge's bench or whatnot, and listen, and then we'll switch around and so forth, so that each team has an opportunity to present, and each team has an opportunity to sit and ask questions and make comments about what you heard and so forth. One of the things that we will be talking about when we do that has to do with advocacy. How various kinds of methods of advocacy. We would spend some time talking about framing and the role of framing, and then what kinds of techniques are effective and not so effective when it comes to advocacy. So we're kind of building each class period some basic skills. We talked about teamwork last week, and it actually seemed to me like the groups formed really pretty good teamwork in the last portion of last week's class. So I think we're cooking along well and so forth. So that's good. So that's kind of how the class is going to play out. Let me go ahead then and get going on zoning. So again, zoning amendments, and flexible zoning. Okay, so zoning is the regulation of permissible, prohibited, and conditionally permissible uses of land in an area or district of the locality with different use designations for different geographic areas. So it is basically identifying geographic areas within the locality for particular use designations. And while we might generally think of big, broad districts, so the downtown business district, various single-family residential subdivisions, commercial commercial corridors and that kind of thing. So we sort of, industrial zones, these big, broad areas. The reality is that in many localities, you have very fine-grained designations where you will have different parcels of land all on the same block or all on the same street zoned differently. Now, probably not every single parcel zoned something different from all the others, but it's not that the whole area will be zoned exactly the same thing. So I think initially zoning was conceived as being about whole big broad sections of the cities. This section of the city is this, that section of the city is that, and segregating those uses that way. But instead what it's turned out to be is that the uses that get attached can vary as much as parcel by parcel. Also, zoning regulates building heights and bulk. Okay, bulk being things like area and density and so forth. Zoning started in New York City in 1916, so the first zoning ordinance. Now, having said that, as you know from the reading, the United States had all kinds of land use regulation well before that. Okay, but in terms of zoning ordinances and zoning codes, it started in 1916. So we're a little bit more than 100 years old with zoning in the United States. Touched on some of this before, but the basic idea here is that the power to zone comes from the police power. Okay? The authority to zone comes from the police power, which is the power of the state government, to regulate, to protect the public health, safety, morals, and welfare. So just to reiterate, when the 13 original colonies in the United States declared independence on July 4th, 1776, and created the United States of America, each of those states became a sovereign, and then therefore had the power that the British Crown had, which included the police power. The power or the authority to zone, though, has been primarily delegated by state legislatures to local units of government, cities and counties primarily, through state zoning enabling legislation. The zoning enabling legislation was patterned in most states off the standard Zoning Enabling Act that was developed by a commission of experts, recruited or authorized by the U.S. Department of Commerce in the 1920s. But each state's Zoning Enabling Act is different from other states in some respect or another. In other words, they're not all cookie cutters of each other, but they are also all relatively similar to each other. And so the basic concept, the basic way that it works is very similar from state to state, but there are variations from state to state. KRS Chapter 100, as I mentioned before, is where you not only find the planning authority, but you find the zoning authority in Kentucky. That so everybody knows, when the state legislature enacts statutes, they can do those at various times, and then the statutes that they enact become codified. If they're supposed to have some sort of general applicability over time, they become codified. So they get plugged into Kentucky Revised Statutes Chapter 100. What's in there might have been enacted at various points in time, but that's sort of the place that you go in the code, the state code, and so forth. The whole idea of zoning in the 19-teens and 1920s grew out of both progressive and conservative thinking. Okay, so this was an interesting area where I don't want to say that the thinking about zoning was exactly the same, but for the most part there was something of a movement in both ends of the political spectrum or ideological spectrum to support zoning. So progressives thought that zoning would bring scientific rationality and planning to cities and to local government and land development patterns. They thought that it would impose structure and order on local communities, so deal with sort of ordering society and preventing sort of chaos and anarchy and so forth. The progressive concept of zoning was that it was about promoting or achieving the public good there's this idea that there's such a thing as the public good, and that it's not just all this interest group versus that interest group. And so zoning would be a mechanism by which the public good could be advanced in land development and land use and infrastructure and so forth, and that you would also get good governance. So the sort of good governance concepts of the progressives in the early 20th century were, again, about pushing back against interest groups, pushing back against machine politics. By machine politics, I mean, that these are like Tammany Hall in New York City or Chicago, where you had these political bosses and people were sort of organized, and you kind of plugged into your local precinct person who told you, and everybody in your family and everybody in your neighborhood how to vote, and you did favors for, and so on and so forth. So that sort of machine politics was anathema to sort of the progressive thinking. And so this whole sort of good governance movement in the United States. And so the idea was more expert-based governance, accountability, protection of the governance system from control by special interests, that sort of idea. So that was sort of the thinking that zoning would advance all of this. Conservatives thought that zoning would protect private property values and people's investment in property, particularly in residences, residential property, but also in commercial property. And perhaps even in industrial property, in the sense that if you had zoning, then that would prevent residences from moving near industry and then trying to push the industry out. Because the manufacturers could say, hey, we're entitled to stay here because this is the industrial district. Conservatives also were eager to have structure and order brought to the cities. And we're going to talk a little bit about what was going on at the time, but that was significant. And then the conservative perspectives definitely tied into beliefs that were dominant at the time about segregating not only uses of land, but people and people groups, immigrants, and segregating whites and blacks and so forth. So basically there was sort of strong support from multiple sectors going on there. And thank you. So I'm gonna cover something in just a minute. I was about to think about introducing a topic, but I'll do it in just a moment. It makes sense in a later slide. And the other thing that we need to understand is about zoning is how it actually gets effectuated is through local government ordinances, codes, charters, that kind of thing. Okay, so basically local legislation. And most local legislation also ends up being codified in some way. A code is really just an organization, a way to find the law in some sort of systematic, structured way. So it's not here and there and somewhere else, but all the topics go together. So for example, Louisville Metro has a land development code, and that land development code is where all kinds of law of ordinances that have been enacted over time get put in some sort of structured location. And you'll spend a lot of time in the land development code in this class. So with respect to zoning, who makes decisions? So the adoption of zoning and generally the amendment of zoning is done by the local legislative body, the city council, the board of aldermen, the county commission, the county court, fiscal court, whatever whatever they're called in that particular state or that particular community, that's who basically adopts and amends zoning. The plan, the comprehensive plan, may be adopted by the Planning Commission. Some communities, it's just called the Plan Commission, but it's more commonly called the Planning Commission. In some localities, the Planning Commission makes recommendations. Basically, they develop the plan and then they recommend it to the city council or the county commission or whoever the legislative body is. Okay? So they can work either way. But generally, the Planning Commission has a fair amount to say over what the plan is. Often, the Planning Commission may make recommendations about zoning changes, so that they may offer opinions about whether a particular proposed zoning change is desirable or not. Okay? In most localities, the Planning Commission, however, cannot change the zoning. That's a legislative act. The Planning Commission is not elected, and so forth. So that's the idea. As we talked about previously, there is a Board of Zoning Adjustment, a Board of Adjustment, a Zoning Board of Appeals. That's another entity that usually makes decisions about permits, exceptions, waivers, those kinds of things. So these are basically some sort of waivers or deviations from the strict application of the zoning code. And so the Planning Commission is usually a group of citizen experts, but usually the Board of Zoning Adjustment or the Board of Zoning Appeals is also a group of citizen experts, but they are often have even a narrower set of sort of technical expertise, a narrower focus. As I may have mentioned, I think I mentioned before, probably over-mentioned, but just in case I didn't, in some jurisdictions, the Planning Commission and the Board of Zoning Adjustment, those functions are combined in one. So when I served on the Planning Commission in the city of Anaheim in California, all of those functions were done by us. There was no separate Board of Zoning Adjustment. So we made recommendations on amendments to the plan, we made recommendations on amendments to the zoning code, and then we actually made the final decisions, unless they were appealed to the city council, but we made the final decisions subject to appeal on things like conditional use permits, variances, subdivision maps, and so forth. Local governments have planning and zoning staff to provide a lot of analysis, expertise, guidance. Very often the staff will make recommendations to the decision makers, and those recommendations often carry quite a bit of weight. They are just staff recommendations, so they don't have any legal power, but because they're made by the experts who are doing the analysis and studying the issues, very often the decision makers take them relatively seriously. Now, having said that, plenty of examples where the staff recommend one thing and, politics comes into play, and in the end, the city council votes completely the opposite way. Okay, there's plenty of examples of that, but nonetheless, usually the city council feels the need to articulate why they've reached a different outlook than the staff did, because again, the staff recommendations out there, everybody sees it, and so it has a certain importance in the process. And there are other local government staff. There be the engineers and infrastructure and utilities people, and so on and so forth. Obviously, the state legislature plays a role in determining what the authority of local governments to zone are, and what the limits to those authority are. Okay, so the legislation plays a big role, but actually, local land use regulation intersects as well not only with state laws that kind of go beyond zoning, but also certain federal laws. So under the Endangered Species Act, if the property is habitat of federally protected, endangered, and threatened species, the landowner or the developer will have to get a federal permit. So there's an added layer, okay? Doesn't displace the local regulation, so a developer might not be able to develop the project if they cannot get a federal permit, but even if they can get a federal permit, they might not be able to develop the project if they can't get a local permit. Okay, so it's sort of layers on top of each other. They're federal wetlands. They're subject to federal jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act. What counts as wetlands that are subject to federal jurisdiction has been changing a lot over the years. The law on this is very much in flux, but there are certain wetlands that are very clearly subject to federal jurisdiction under anybody's definition. And then there are also certain wetlands that are not subject to federal jurisdiction under most interpretations of the Clean Water Act. I'm not saying under anybody's jurisdiction, because there are environmentalists and hydrologists who would say it's all subject to the Clean Water Act, but they're scientists, they're not lawyers, so basically we have, here's clearly covered, here's clearly not covered, and then a lot of back and forth in the middle about what is federally protected. But if the development is going to disturb or fill those wetlands, then a Section 404 permit under the Clean Water Act is required. Brownfields, if the property is contaminated or perceived to be contaminated by hazardous waste, there is liability, financial liability, that attaches under the Superfund statute. Statute's called CERCLA. I'm not going to go into it. You can look it up. I'm not going to go into all this. Anyway, I won't do that to you. But basically, the bottom line is that there are various procedures that state and local governments use to ensure proper cleanups under the Superfund law, even if the property is not a Superfund site. Okay, so Superfund is a particular list of very contaminated properties that's kept by the federal government. But under the law, under CERCLA, anything that's a brownfield, which is just a term that's used to refer to a contaminated site, or a potentially contaminated site, there's going to have to be investigation and probably cleanup before anybody's willing to develop the property, and before anybody's willing to buy the property and develop it. Okay, so there are certain procedures where local approvals intersect with federal requirements, and they work together. Telecommunications towers. Local governments may regulate telecommunication towers to an extent. They cannot prohibit them altogether. The regulations cannot be too burdensome. But on the other hand, even though telecommunication towers are partly protected by the federal government, by the FCC, that the local government can prevent you from putting, a massive, ugly concrete tower, zillions of feet into the air, right in the middle, right smack dab in the middle of the historic district, for example, right? So they can regulate size, height, location, and so forth, up to a reasonable degree. Of course, this area has been a bit of a dance between local governments and the telecommunications industry. I will sort of again, I'm sort of relate an experience. So we would, we got a lot of these before the Anaheim Planning Commission requests. Anaheim required a conditional use permit for telecommunications towers, and so what we would do is we would again apply a set of standards that are things like appropriate height, appropriate location, screening to the extent possible, etc. So there'd be people on the planning staff, and one or two of my colleagues on the planning commission that would say, we have too many of these, they're ugly, they're bad for the city, they don't constitute good planning, we're just selling our soul to the telecommunications industry, so we should not allow them. Okay, and the rest of us and the deputy city attorney would remind them that you cannot just prohibit telecommunications towers altogether, right? You cannot be overly burdensome. On the other hand, we would get some representatives of the telecommunication industry that would come in and they would propose a really good idea. They're like, hey, we want to get increased coverage in this particular area, and we note that there is this pagoda-style building in the park that has a tower, and that would be a perfect place to place that and hide it. And we're like, awesome, let's do it. It's right. It's out of everybody's way. It's screened. It's hidden. Nobody knows that it's there, and so forth. So there were things like that. So one of the ones was in it was a movie theater, and it was faux old west saloon style looking, one of those kind of buildings with it looked like a Hollywood set, right? it was typical Southern California. It was cheesy, right? But there was nothing in the tower, right? Thankfully, like no sniper, but nothing in the tower, right? And so we're like, of course, that's the place to put a cell antenna, so that's great. But then we would get the people who would come in and say, well, we absolutely need it here, and it needs to be huge. It needs to be this tall, and it was going to be like right along a major street with lots of nice houses and pretty trees and so on and so forth, and it was just going to be right in the middle of everything. And we would say, well, that, and what they would say is, our engineers tell us it has to be like this. And we would say, well, we're so sorry, we're going to have to deny the permit because this is just simply too large and too ugly and so forth. And then they would say, oh, well, actually, it can be smaller and it can be in this other location. And so, and then of course they, and so on and so forth. And so, because they didn't want a permit denial, but they were trying to bluff the city. So what we would say, so actually, eventually, with one person, we called their boss and said, don't send him back. Don't send him to the planning commission again because he lies. Every presentation starts with a monstrous lie that is just not true. And I said, that's not helpful, right? We need to get down to negotiating over what it's actually going to be, not this, it absolutely must be this monstrosity that, So we just said, don't bother, and so forth. So that was part of it. But, what was happening, of course, was that the telecommunications companies thought that they could push aggressively on local governments, and they thought that Southern California has all these little local governments, and that they would cave in. And we're like, no. Come on, we can read the law. We know what's required and what's not, and so forth. The other thing that they wanted to do for a while, it was what was popular were to disguise these as pine trees or palm trees. Has anybody ever seen those? Okay, they're ridiculous. They're ridiculous. Okay, I mean, every amusement park in the world has more realistic palm trees and pine trees than these cell towers. I mean, it was crazy. It was like they didn't look like palm trees or pine trees. And we're like, no, just make a tower. I mean, don't do something silly like that. So anyway, so that's an example of how federal law intersects with local power. But the basic idea is that zoning and land use regulation is primarily local. So, traditional Euclidean zoning. What do I mean by this? I mean, this is the concept of zoning, the basic concept that we started with over 100 years ago that was addressed in the Euclid case. It's a little bit of a play on words because, you know, it relates to some degree to Euclidean geometry. Makes you think, if you ever are drawing a zoning map, it makes you shudder and think about high school geometry and so forth. But the basic idea here is that zoning regulates uses, heights, and bulk. However, I also want to make clear, as we're going to get into shortly in the lecture, that traditional Euclidean zoning is not the main aspect or main part of zoning, or this is not what we've been left with 100 years later. That zoning has morphed, has changed, there's a whole lot more to it. Okay, so traditional Euclidean zoning is the favorite punching bag of all sorts of critics of the land use regulatory system. And probably justifiably so in some ways, but also in many ways it's a paper tiger, right? I mean, it's an easy thing to criticize because it's a very basic kind of concept. And we've done so much more with our zoning codes. So we'll get into that. But basically, traditional Euclidean zoning regulates categories of uses by various zones and districts. The big four categories of districts. Okay, so categories, so these are big, broad categories, are residential, commercial, industrial, and agriculture and open space. But there are others, some other categories, and within each of these categories, most localities have multiple designations. So there will be, for example, low density, single family residential. Low to medium density, single family density, residential. Medium to high density, single family residential. High density, single family residential. Single family residential conservation subdivision. Okay, so that could be, what did I say, 5 different possibilities just on single family. Multifamily will be, again, various densities, high, low, medium, duplex, quadplex, apartments, condos, various kinds of multifamily residential designations. Commercial, okay, so you will have something, generally there's like a C1 and then a C2, but then there's like, GBD, General Business District, DBD, Downtown Business District, okay, various kinds. Okay, and of course, as you might imagine, downtown business district in most cities is going to be tall office towers, right? Okay, tall office towers is a different kind of commercial development than a bunch of retail shops and restaurants and bars on Bardstown Road, right? Or out in St. Matthews, right? That's all, none of that's tall, right? That's all low. Some of them are in old houses and so forth, right? It's a different kind of commercial development. There may be office professional, right, as a designation. So a bunch of different kinds of commercial designations. And again, it varies by locality to locality. You're going to read what's in the zoning code, but what you're looking for, you should not be surprised to find a bunch of different commercial and office type of and retail type of use designations. Industrial. Almost all localities have at least a heavy industrial district and a light industrial district. Light industrial being things like warehouses and that kind of stuff. Sometimes things like electronics, so things that aren't as intensive. Obviously, heavy industrial will be things like, like a cement factory or a chemical factory or something. But there might be more industrial designations. Agriculture and open space, those may be two totally different things. It may be agriculture, maybe open space, and then other things. Institutional uses or educational uses, things, designations for this is where city government buildings are going to be, and so on and so forth. A lot of different possibilities. Traditional Euclidean zoning regulates the height of structures, okay? How tall they can be. And then it also regulates bulk, okay? So bulk is the amount of density. How many units are allowed? How many units per whatever, acre, per square foot, per whatever. How much square footage may be developed, how many people per acre, that kind of thing. So that's density. Lot size or lot area. What are the minimum lot sizes and what are the maximum lot sizes in a particular district? Okay, so as you might imagine, there is a fair amount of overlap between certain kinds of single-family residential zoning and large lot requirements, right? So you imagine the kind of big, huge lots with big, huge houses and so forth. Okay, so that kind of thing. Setbacks. Setbacks are how far from the property line, and you have front setbacks, rear setbacks, and side setbacks, okay? So how far from each of those property lines must the structure be set back, okay? Structure cannot be closer than 3 feet from each side, 5 feet from the front, 2 feet in the back, or something like that, right? Okay, so in the rear, right? Does everybody see that kind of idea? So that tells you how it's supposed to be set back. So in a zero lot line, by the way, means that the development can go to all lot lines, all to the parcel boundaries all the way around. Okay, so in other words, zero lot line is no setbacks on any side. Okay, so when we talk about zero lot line development, that's the idea. And so you could, you've seen places where that's the case. So, for example, I know they've been trying to do something after the fire, but the Whiskey Row downtown, right? It goes right. So every building goes right up to the next one, right, and go right up to the sidewalk in front, right? Everybody see? Okay, you see what I'm saying? Which is obviously very different than, say, if you go to some sort of office building out on Shelbyville Road out far east, right? And you're set way back from the street and way back from all sides and kind of like smack dab in the middle of the property, okay? Florida area ratios, okay, FAR, okay, this is called FAR, Florida area ratio, and it is about the amount of square footage of floor space in the building as a ratio to the amount of square footage of the lot size. Okay? So, all right, so this tells you, in other words, if whatever the lot is, how much can you build, how many different floors, basically, can you build? Okay, so let me just give you an example. Okay, so if you have an FAR of 4, right? So that means that you can build 4 times the amount of square footage of floor space on that lot than the square footage of the size of the lot. So what's that going to mean? If you have a 0 setback, it's 4 stories, right? Does everybody see? There's 0 setback, it means that you can get 4 stories. Huh? Everybody follow? Okay. If your setbacks mean that you can only develop half of the parcel, 8 stories. You get 8 stories out of it, right? In order to get 4 times the square footage, if you're only building half of the lot, that means it has to be 8. You're like, some of you are looking at me like, I didn't think there was going to be any math in this class, right? And others of you are like, wow, I wish my quantitative analysis class of the urban planning program was this simple, right? So you're on opposite ends of the spectrum here, right? Yes?
Why is that different from height?
Okay, because a height is a specific amount. So I'm going to talk about that in just a second, okay? But anyway, basically what I want you to understand here is I don't care if you can do the math because you're going to be working on teams, so somebody who can do the math will do it for you. Okay, but the bottom line here is just to understand the concept that in zoning, we are regulating the amount of developed floor space in relationship to the lot size, okay? So let's assume that your setbacks, you've got your zone for commercial, you're going to build an office building, and your setbacks allow you to only develop half of the parcel. Okay, so once you do all the setbacks, you only half of the parcel. And your FAR is 4, like I said. But your height restriction, the height restriction that applies to your parcel of land in the zoning code, allows you only 6 stories. Wow, now there is an inconsistency between the FAR, which tells you could have, so the FAR is 8, the setbacks, which make that necessary, and then your height limit, which is 6, right? Okay, now that's exactly the kind of scenario where you might have some sort of inconsistency in the zoning code, and it might be a basis for a height variance. Okay, so we're talking about variances next week, but I just want to call your attention. It might be a legal justification because you can't actually get the FAR you're entitled to because of the height limitation. Does everybody see that? There's an inconsistency there, and so it might entitle you to a variance. Stepping back from the details more broadly, the zoning code has 2 components. The text, which in the text is going to say what's allowed in a particular zone, what's prohibited in that particular zone, and this is each zone. You're going to have the text for each zone, and what's conditionally allowed. Conditionally allowed are uses that are allowed only if you get a permit, a conditional use permit, and meet certain conditions. We're talking about conditional use permits next week. Okay? So, but just to be aware, this is where you're going to find the list. And then some other regulations and so forth in the text. The zoning code will also contain a map. And a map has all the land in the city, and it will indicate on the map the various zones for each parcel of land. Okay? And it might be, the zoning might be broad. Okay, so there might be this, might be 12 parcels that are all zone C1, and it just shows up a big, so you see the boundaries on the map and you see that it covers all these parcels. But you're going to be able to tell from the map what any given parcel is zoned, okay? And so when the government is, when local government is creating zoning or amending zoning, they may be doing this with text. They may be putting the rules in the text. They may be designating particular uses, heights, bulk on the map, or both, depending on what they're trying to do. But the underlying concept of Euclidean zoning is one of compatibility. What we aim to do under traditional Euclidean zoning is to segregate incompatible uses, heights, and bulk. So we don't have the little quaint cottage next to the 50-story office tower. We don't have the elder care facility next to the industrial plant that's spewing out all kinds of pollutants. We don't have the strip mining next to the park, etc. That's sort of the idea. There are a whole lot of other things in zoning codes today. So this is going beyond traditional Euclidean zoning. So it's thinking more broadly. There are parking requirements. Very first class session, people already talked about the fact that many of our zoning codes require too much parking, that we overpark. We require too much parking, but that's pretty standard. Apartment complexes will be provisions in the zoning code designating how much parking per unit. Commercial, it might have to do with square footage and so forth. This much square footage of office space requires that many spaces of parking, that kind of thing. And it may designate what kind. It may say, surface lot. It may say garage. And so forth. One of the goals of local government in many places is to discourage on-street parking. It's to discourage on-street parking. The theory is that people parking on the street causes a lot of congestion, it causes traffic problems, it doesn't look pretty, etc. Now obviously, you go somewhere downtown, there's lots of on-street parking, but there's also, you cannot park everybody who needs to park downtown on the street. And so there are various parking facilities, but then there's this tension between surface lots which don't use the land very efficiently, garages, how are the garages designed, and so on and so forth. Landscaping requirements. So zoning codes will require particular kinds of landscaping for particular kinds of projects. Historic preservation. So preserving historic structures, historic districts, perhaps requiring certain architectural and design features that are compatible with the sort of historic architecture and design in that neighborhood. More generally, there may be architecture and design requirements and so forth. Accessory uses, things like garages. With sort of residential things, will be things like garages, swimming pools, tennis courts, fences, all that kind of stuff. What's allowed, what's conditionally allowed, what's have to get a permit, what is prohibited, and so forth. One of the things that some states went down the road of was enacting state statutes that require localities to accommodate what we call granny flats, okay, as part of the in connection with any single-family residential property. These are, you build the home, build the separate unit above the garage, or you convert the garage, or you build something out back in the backyard that's a unit that, presumably, an elderly parent or grandparent could live in, or something like that. And of course, we talked about California has lots of development pressure, so what started out was as granny flats quickly became not people's elderly relatives, but instead became separately leasable space, and so you ended up with the family of 12 living in what was the granny flat. We talked about previously about the problems in Anaheim and how they weren't building enough housing for the population growth. Yeah? But not just there. I mean, lots of places. Environmental features and conservation. Signage is a big one. What kind of signage is allowed? How big? What's its location with respect to the street, right? You've all been on streets where there's just this mass proliferation of signage everywhere. It's ugly. It's distracting. But it's just you go down the street. It's just signs, and flashing and ugly and whatever other. And then, you also have been on streets where obviously signage is so highly regulated that you can't find. You don't even know what street you're on, much less, where, you're trying to find the doctor's office, and it's like some little thing in, some pretty looking tile, but nobody could possibly read it, even standing right in front of it, much less driving by it, right? And so, various regulations of signage. Contribution to public facilities. So how much does the developer have to contribute to schools, to streets, to traffic control mechanisms, to parks, that kind of thing. A lot of regulations regarding transportation, access of vehicles to and from, ingress and egress. Okay, so think about this. If you're building a large apartment complex on a busy street, what does the zoning code say about how many points of entry and exit? Okay, if you only have one, it's in the middle of the block with no traffic signage or no traffic signal, nothing to stop the traffic on the busy street. I guarantee, and it's a large apartment complex, I guarantee you that you just better plan on the accidents, right? As the people are trying to go in and out, turn left and right, and so on and so forth, with that many cars going in and out every day, right? One point of entrance and exit for an entire large complex of that sort in that kind of scenario is inadequate. I mean, it's inadequate. You either need a traffic light or some sort of mechanism to stop the traffic. You need to time the lights at the other ends of the streets to the other sides of the apartment complex so that you get gaps, or something. You need to create more lanes so people can get in off the street and not stack up behind themselves, and so on and so forth. But it's an issue. Rights of way, things like easements and so forth. So all that kind of stuff will appear in zoning codes. Some pretty pictures that show different kinds of uses. The residential subdivision in Murray Hill that I talked about earlier is where I live. Rubber Town, right? The factory. This is from Rubber Town. This is bluegrass horse country out in by Lexington, conserved, so protected from development. And over here is where chair-throwing basketball players hang out. In Lawrence, Kansas, that's the historic downtown. The main street downtown is called Massachusetts Street, because all the streets were sort of in the order of the states in the Union, and so the Mass Ave is is sort of the main downtown historic place with lots of, and it's still got the old-fashioned barber and the the cool brewery and the old bank from the 1800s and so on and so forth. So little shops, yes, sir.
So there's like broad categories of use in the regulatory structure. What about something that mixes business with a home, like
It's not allowed.
No.
No, I'm teasing. No,
Well, I was thinking like Airbnb.
Let me get to that in just a second. Let me show you a couple more slides and then. Okay. So this is West Louisville. It actually starts over here in Old Louisville. So this is Fourth and this is Oak. Right, everybody, not too far from here, right? Okay. So and there's the river over there. What's this? Rubber Town, M3, heavy industrial. Okay, so what that tells you that Louisville has at least 3 manufacturing industrial districts, right? M3, and that's Rubber Town. But look at the designation. So this whole area here is R5. It's a particular residential district. It's probably a little bit higher density and so forth. This is R1, and I actually might have that backwards. I might have but anyway. So. Here's C1, some commercial districts and so forth. But note, here's residential, and here's M2 right next to it, right? And here's EZ1, I'm going to describe that in a moment. Here's R1, totally different kind of residential. C1 here, right? You see how you get, even though initially the idea was to segregate incompatible uses, over time, different parcels have been zoned in different ways, so we end up with this patchwork kind of reality. Now, you go out on the east end, you do have big, broad areas that are residential, but even with that, you have these sort of commercial corridors and so on and so forth. EZ is enterprise zone, okay, and it is meant to encourage, it allows lots of uses. It's meant to encourage development. It's meant to sort of revitalize the area by allowing lots of different kinds of uses. So that, but one of the things that you see with this is there, other than possibly something like EZ, there aren't a lot of designations that involve mixes of uses. Now, once we start getting into the zoning code, the text of the zoning code, we might find that, say, for example, maybe in one of these R districts, you could have some mix of commercial and residential. But by and large, sort of one of the traditional critiques of Euclidean zoning is that uses are segregated, and so you don't get mixed use like, say, for example, what you might see out at Norton Commons, where you might have these shops and then you have residential above and so forth, or the residential and the shops are, kind of side by side on the same block and so forth. Norton Commons is meant to mimic how land use patterns used to be in the earlier part of the nation's history, when more mixes of uses were allowed, when this was more of the kind of village concept. It is totally ahistorical. Okay, so Norton Commons, even though, does anybody like Norton Commons? People like it? Sure, you like it. Okay, some people, okay. All right, people do. I mean, there are people who like Norton Commons and so forth. But there's some things about it that don't match how it was sort of the theory behind what is called new urbanism. Okay, so it's new urbanist development. The classic new urbanist development is Seaside, Florida. Anybody see the movie